Translate this and I'll marry you." The words cracked across the boardroom like a whip. Samantha Hale waved the contract above her head, its columns of Chinese characters marching down the page, and 15 executives detonated into laughter. Every head turned toward the man by the door. Gray uniform, a rag in one hand, a spray bottle in the other. Michael Turner kept his eyes on the glass, wiping slow circles jaw set, saying nothing. Just the janitor. Invisible furniture in a room built for power. Then his gaze flicked to the page. 1 second, no more. Something crossed his face and vanished, a flicker of recognition, buried the instant it surfaced. The laughter swelled around him. He dipped his head and turned back to the glass, and not one person in that room knew who he truly was. Underscore, 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 underscore. The meeting broke a few minutes later. Chairs scraped. Laughter thinned into the hum of small talk, and the executives drifted out with their coffee cups and their phones, already forgetting a joke that had cost them nothing. Michael waited by the wall until the last of them cleared the door. Then he rolled his cart to the long table and began gathering the debris of a morning that had mattered to everyone but him. Crumpled napkins, an empty creamer, a legal pad scrawled with someone's idle diagrams. The contract lay where Samantha had let it fall at the head of the table. He should have left it alone. He knew the rule without anyone ever speaking it aloud. A man in a gray uniform did not touch the paperwork of a company like Hale Innovations. But his hand moved ahead of his judgment, and he tilted the cover page toward the window light. Meridian Semiconductor. Taipei. He knew the letterhead, the thin blue rule along the top, the characters he could still read as easily as the letters of his own name. And under the company seal in the block reserved for the lead negotiator sat a name he had not seen in more than a decade. Raymond Ellis. The room seemed to tilt half a degree. For a moment, Michael was not standing in a glass tower with a spray bottle hooked to his belt. He was younger, sharper, seated across a lacquered table in a government hall, where every sentence carried the weight of a trade agreement, matching wits with a man who bargained like a chess master and laughed like an old friend the instant the pens were capped. He set the page down exactly as he had found it, squared the corner, and stepped back. Some doors once shut were meant to stay shut. His hand went to the pen in his breast pocket, an old reflex, the way other men reached for a wedding ring they still wore. Black lacquer gone dull at the edges, a line of engraving worn smooth under his thumb. Words are the bridge between worlds. Anna had given it to him the day he was sworn in, back when the road ahead had looked long and open and entirely theirs. She had been an interpreter, the finest in the delegation, the one who could carry not just the meaning of a sentence, but the intention hiding beneath it. He had loved her for that, for the way she listened to what people were too careful to say. They had married in Taipei in a small ceremony with borrowed chairs, and for a while the whole world had seemed like a language the two of them were fluent in together. Then, 3 years ago, a stroke took her in a single afternoon, with no warning and no chance to say the things that mattered. Grace had been 3 years old, and Michael, who had spent his career finding words for impossible situations, discovered there were none for this one. He did not resign so much as walk quietly off the edge of his old life. The career had demanded everything, the late flights, the weeks abroad, the phone that never stopped, and he made himself a promise. In the worst of the grief, never again would ambition take from his daughter the way it had once taken from him. The diplomatic corps called twice. He let both calls go, and Mandarin, the language he and Anna had built their whole life inside, became a thing he could not touch without bleeding, so he set it down along with everything else. A janitor's schedule had one virtue no corner office could offer. He could trade shifts. He could leave at 3 in the afternoon when the cardiology clinic only had a 3:15. He could be above all else there. So he wheeled a cart through the same building where he had once been the kind of man who sat at the head of the table, and he let them all believe he was no one worth remembering. He finished the boardroom, killed the lights, and clocked out into a gray November evening. Denise from 2 doors down had Grace at her apartment the way she did on the long days. She ran a press at the Hale manufacturing plant on the north side and had never once told Michael no when he needed someone to sit with his daughter. Grace was on the floor with a coloring book when he came in, and she launched herself at his knees like she hadn't seen him in a month. "Daddy, I made you a blue horse," she announced. "Horses aren't blue, but I made him blue anyway." "A blue horse is exactly what I needed," Michael said, and meant it. Denise walked them to the door. "She barely sat still all afternoon," she told him, smiling though something tired sat behind her eyes. "Good day for her. You get some rest, Michael. You look like you're carrying the building around on your back." He thanked her, and he didn't tell her that he was. Grace fell asleep on the couch before 8, one hand curled under her cheek, her breath making the small, effortful sound. It always made the sound of a heart working harder than a 6-year-old's heart should have to. Michael sat and watched the rise and fall of it, the way he had watched it every night for as long as he could remember. He had the numbers memorized. He knew the name of the valve and the shape of the shadow on the echocardiogram, and the exact pitch of the doctor's voice when the news was going to be bad. His phone lit at 9 minutes past 9. It was the clinic's after-hours line, and the cardiologist's voice on the other end was gentle in the careful way that always meant something had shifted. Grace's condition had reached the point they had been watching for. The repair could not keep waiting. And there was a complication that had nothing to do with medicine. Dr. Reeves, the surgeon who had followed Grace's case since she was an infant, the one pair of hands Michael trusted without reservation, was leaving the hospital at the end of the week for a post across the country. He had one opening left on his schedule before he went. One, roughly a week out. "I want her in that slot, Mr. Turner," the doctor said. "I don't want to hand her to someone who's meeting her for the first time. But the hospital won't hold a surgical date on an outstanding balance. To secure it, they'll need the portion your plan won't cover paid up front." Michael already knew the shape of the answer before he asked the size of it. How much? After insurance, a little over $70,000. The number landed in the quiet room and did not move. $70,000. He made a little over $30,000 in a year, pushing a cart through other people's evenings. He had no savings that hadn't already been swallowed by the last 2 years of appointments. There was no card left with room on it. No relative with that kind of money. No honest arithmetic in the world that turned his life into that figure inside of a week. He thanked the doctor because there was nothing else to say, and set the phone face down on his knee. Across the room, Grace breathed her difficult breath. The blue horse lay on the coffee table where she'd left it, grinning up at the ceiling. He went back to work the next night because he could not afford not to, and because the apartment had become a place he could no longer sit still inside of. The 11th floor was dark and empty when he reached it, the whole executive level reduced to the green glow of exit signs and the low sigh of the ventilation. He was emptying the bins along the glass wall when he saw them. A stack of printed pages fanned across the boardroom table left there by the sales team at the end of the day. A yellow sticky note rode the top sheet in someone's hurried hand. Rough version interpreters still traveling. Do not send. It was the Meridian contract. Beside the original sat a translation, and even from across the room, Michael could tell what it was. A machine had chewed through the Chinese and spat out English that was grammatically upright and completely deaf to meaning. He should have wiped the table and moved on. Instead, he stood over the pages, and the old instinct woke up in him like a muscle that had only been sleeping. He read the first clause, then the second. The software had rendered the words and lost the intention beneath them, the exact thing Anna used to say a real translator was for. A courtesy phrase had become a demand. A conditional had hardened into a promise. And near the end of the contract, buried in a subclause about workforce and transition, sat a line so badly mangled that the English said the gentle, reassuring opposite of what the Chinese actually reserved the right to do. Michael read that one 3 times. In the language of the men he used to sit across from it, was not a mistake at all. It was the kind of soft, deliberate blur that got written on purpose by people who were counting on the other side to trust the translation instead of the text. His thumb found the engraving on the pen without his telling it to. He knew exactly what walking into Samantha Hale's office and announcing he could read this contract would cost him. The disbelief, first the U in 15 faces. Then the questions, the ones that pulled the thread on a past he had spent 3 years knotting, shut the ones that ended with a company deciding a man who had hidden something that large was a man who couldn't be trusted with a mop, let alone a mystery. He would lose the schedule that let him be at the 3:15. He would lose the one thing his grief had built to protect his daughter. But $70,000 sat on one side of the scale, and a week sat on the other, and somewhere in this building was a piece of paper worth more than his silence. So he did not announce anything. He uncapped Anna's pen, and in the narrow margin beside the worst of the clauses, in the small, precise hand he had once used to redline treaties, he wrote what the Chinese truly said. He corrected the courtesy phrase. He untangled the conditional. And beside the buried subclause, the one that set off every instinct he had, he drew a careful line and wrote 3 words. This is deliberate. He did not sign his name. His name would open every door he had spent years bolting shut. At the bottom of the last page where a signature belonged, he wrote 2 other words instead, and told himself it was only a test, that if the work was seen, if it was wanted, there might yet be a way to trade what he knew for what his daughter needed, without ever stepping into the light. Night scribe. He kept the pen, squared the pages into a neat stack, the way he'd found them, and wheeled his cart back into the dark, not knowing he had just handed the first thread of his own secret to the last man in the building who deserved it. The corrections did not stay secret past 9 the next morning. Grant Whitfield reached the boardroom before the coffee had finished brewing, the way he reached everything first, and found the pages exactly where the sales team had abandoned them. He was a tall man who wore ambition like cologne, the kind who had learned early that in a company this size credit did not go to the person who did the work, but to the person standing nearest when the work was noticed. He flipped through the stack out of habit, and then he stopped flipping. Someone had gone through the machine translation line by line. In the margins, in a small, precise hand, sat corrections that did not read like corrections at all. They read like a person who understood what the words were trying to hide. A courtesy phrase restored, a conditional pulled back into shape, and beside one buried clause, circled and underlined 3 words that made his skin prickle. This is deliberate. At the bottom of the last page where a name should have been, someone had written, Night Scribe. Grant stood over the pages for a long moment, while the machinery of his career turned behind his eyes. He did not know who had written this. He did not, in the end, care. What he understood instantly completely was that whoever had done it was not in the room to claim it, and that a thing left unclaimed in a building like this one belonged to whoever spoke up first. By 10 o'clock, he was in Samantha Hale's office with the pages under his arm and a story already assembled. I had a feeling about the machine draft, he told her, laying the stack on her desk like an offering. So I brought in an outside consultant over the weekend. Confidential, you understand, given how sensitive Meridian is. I went through every line with him myself. He tapped the circled clause with one finger. This one right here nearly slipped past all of us. I flagged it. Samantha Hale looked at the pages, and then she looked at Grant, and something in her went very still and very quiet. The stillness of a woman who had built a company by knowing when a story fit the man telling it, and when it did not. You reviewed all of this, she said. Personally, She did not answer right away. She turned the top page toward the light the way Michael had turned it 2 nights before and read the small hand in the margin. She ran a technology company. She had signed the checks for 3 different translation vendors. She knew what software produced and what it did not. And she knew that no machine and no rushed consultant wrote a note like, "This is deliberate." That was a sentence written by someone who had sat across a table from people who lied for a living and had learned to smell it. It did not sound like Grant. It did not sound like anyone she employed. But Meridian was the largest partnership Hale had ever attempted. The interpreters were still days from returning, and in front of her sat a corrected contract and a senior executive volunteering to carry it. A CEO did not have the luxury of refusing a lifeline because she doubted the hand that offered it. "All right," she said at last. "You've been closest to it. You'll lead the working sessions with Meridian until the interpreters are back. Don't make me regret it." Grant smiled the smile of a man who had never in his life expected to regret anything. "You won't." What neither of them said aloud, and what only one of them noticed, was the shape of the promise Grant had just made. He had claimed the pages. He had claimed the review. He had been careful some animal caution had kept him from it, never once to claim that he could read a single character of the language itself. Michael learned all of it from the far side of a glass wall, the way he learned everything now. He was wiping down the 11th floor corridor when he saw Grant come out of Samantha's office with the pages under his arm and triumph in his walk. He heard through a door left ajar the words "outside consultant" and flagged it myself, and he felt the particular helplessness of watching a thing you had made with your own hands walk out of the room in another man's arms. He said nothing. There was nothing a janitor could say. He gathered his cart and rode the service elevator down, and the whole way he told himself it did not matter who got the credit, so long as the corrections did their work, so long as the buried clause got seen. That was the story he needed, and he held on to it the way a man holds a railing on a moving train. The story lasted until that night when he went back to the clause he had flagged. He had only ever meant to fix what the machine had broken and walk away. But the 11th floor was dark and quiet again. The full Meridian contract still spread across the boardroom table, where the deal team had left it for the night, and the old discipline in him would not let a half-understood thing lie. So he sat under the green glow of the exit signs and read the buried transition clause again. Not the words this time, but the machinery crouched beneath them. And this time he understood exactly what it was built to do. It was written as a transition provision dry procedural, the kind of language a tired eye slid straight over. On its surface, it promised continuity of operations. But the Chinese underneath reserved in soft and deniable phrasing the partner's right to consolidate manufacturing after the agreement closed, not a threat. Not even a plan a lawyer could point to. Just a door left carefully unlocked that a company could walk through a year later to shutter a plant and move the work overseas and swear the whole time that nothing in the contract had ever said they would. The abstraction of it burned away as he read. Consolidate manufacturing. He knew which plant. Hale ran one facility that did this kind of production on the north side of the city, and he knew it because Denise ran a press there on the day shift, and because it was Denise who sat on his floor with Grace when the clinic could only see her at 3:15. Denise, who had never once told him no. Behind that plant stood hundreds of people who went in every morning believing their jobs were safe. And behind those people stood their own children, their own 315s, their own arithmetic that did not survive a layoff. He sat very still in the dark and understood that the numbers on the page were not numbers at all. He knew this move, not just as a translator, as a man who had once sat across from exactly this kind of table. A clause built to be misread was not an accident of a rushed draft. It was a technique, patient and old. and he had seen it before, years ago, across a lacquered table from the same man whose name sat on the letterhead, now Raymond Ellis, who could bury a knife in a paragraph and shake your hand while he did it. Ellis had not changed his methods in a decade. He had only found a company that couldn't read him. And there it was, the choice Michael had spent 3 years arranging his whole life to avoid. He could keep doing what he had done, fix the language quietly in the margins, under a name that wasn't his, and let the corrections do what they could, while he stayed safely invisible. That path kept his schedule, kept his job, kept the fragile machine of appointments and shift trades that let him be a father. It might even earn him somehow the money that a slot on Dr. Reeves's calendar demanded inside of a week. Or he could step into the light and tell them plainly what this contract was built to do, and lose in the telling the only version of his life that could get his daughter to that surgery. One path saved Denise and every worker like her. The other path saved Grace, and for the first time since Anna died, Michael did not know which promise he was allowed to break. He uncapped Anna's pen. In the margin beside the transition clause in the small hand that had once redlined agreements between governments, he wrote what the Chinese truly reserved the right to do. And beneath it, because he could not stop himself, he wrote a single line meant for whatever eyes finally read it. Honestly. These are people, not provisions. He did not know that this time, someone other than Grant was already looking. Samantha Hale had not stopped thinking about the sentence in the margin. This is deliberate. Days after Grant carried the pages out of her office, the note still sat wrong with her, a splinter she could not stop pressing. She had gone back to the archived draft twice and read the corrections again, and each time she came away more certain of the same impossible thing. The hand that wrote them belonged to someone who understood negotiation the way she understood a balance sheet instinctively from the inside. Grant did not have that. Grant had confidence, which was a different substance entirely, and easily mistaken for it by people who wanted to be fooled. So she began quietly to look. She pulled the building's after-hours access logs and found nothing. The pages had been touched by no one who badged in, which meant by someone already inside after the day shift left. She asked her assistant without explaining who had keys to the 11th floor at night. And she started staying late herself, telling herself it was the Meridian deal, keeping her at her desk past 10, when the truth was that she wanted to catch the ghost who signed himself Night Scribe. That was how she came to be standing at the floor-to-ceiling window late one evening, the city spread out cold and glittering below her, when the door at the far end of the boardroom opened, and a man in a gray uniform pushed a cart into the room and stopped short at the sight of her. "I'm sorry," Michael said, already turning to go. "I can come back." "No." The word came out faster than she intended. She turned from the glass. "No, stay. Finish. I'm not going anywhere for a while." He worked in silence for a minute, wiping the long table down, and she watched him without quite meaning to the economy of the way he moved, the way he squared the chairs. By feel the sense she couldn't shake, that she had seen his face somewhere that her memory refused to place. She was tired enough, and the office was quiet enough, that she said the thing out loud that she had been carrying for days. "Can I ask you something? You're in this building at hours nobody else is." She studied him. "Have you ever seen anyone up here at night? Someone who doesn't belong on this floor after dark?" Michael's hand kept moving on the glass. "People come and go," he said. "I try not to notice. It's easier if the furniture doesn't watch you." Something in the phrasing made her almost smile. She leaned against the table. "That's about how they treat all of us, isn't it? When the numbers are big enough. I've got a partnership on this table worth more than everything else I've built, and I've got the whole board breathing down my neck to close it. And somewhere in this building there's a person who saw something in it that a dozen people I pay very well missed completely. And I can't find him." She shook her head. "I don't even know why I'm telling you this. Sometimes it's easier to say things to the furniture." Michael straightened, and for one moment, he let himself look at her directly. This person you're looking for. What did he see? He flagged a clause, buried in the back, called it deliberate. She watched his face and saw nothing move on it. Everyone tells me it's boilerplate. Continuity language, standard. Then, whoever wrote your contract chose a strange place to be standard. Michael set his cloth on the cart, and he weighed the risk the way he weighed everything now against a hospital bill, and a week, and decided he could give her this much without giving her himself. If I were you, he said carefully, and I'm nobody, so take it for what it's worth, I wouldn't read the clauses that sound alarming. I'd read the one that sounds the most boring, the one everyone's sure is standard. That's usually where the important things hide, where nobody thinks to look. Like the night crew, she stared at him, and for one dangerous instant, the whole shape of the thing hovered in the air between them, close enough to touch. Then he dipped his head and pushed his cart toward the door. "Good night, Miss Hale." "Good night," she said to the empty room already reaching for the contract. Grant found out who Night Scribe was the next day, and he found out by accident. He had been trying to learn the name himself, not out of curiosity, but because a claimed thing was only safe once you knew who might come to take it back. He had pulled a favor in Human Resources, asked which staff had building access after hours, and gone paging through personnel files that a VP of sales had no honest business reading. Most were what he expected: security, custodial, night maintenance. Names that meant nothing. Then he opened the file on the custodian assigned to the executive floors, and the background screening clipped behind the paperwork stopped him cold. The application itself was thin, deliberately thin, a work history that began 3 years ago and explained nothing before it. But the pre-employment check told a different story than the application did, and on that page stood a different man entirely. A degree in international relations, years abroad, a line half buried, listing prior government service, and a language proficiency the application had never once mentioned. Grant read it twice, and then he laughed under his breath in the empty records room, because the universe had just handed him the one thing his whole assembled story had been missing. Not a rival to fear, but a man he could own. He found Michael that evening in the custodial room off the loading dock, where the mops hung in their steel sink, and Michael was signing out for the night. Grant leaned in the doorway with the particular ease of a man who had just discovered he held every card. "Michael Turner," Grant said, tasting the name. "You know I've walked past you for a year and never once looked at you. Funny what turns up when you finally look." Michael went still at the sink. "Can I help you with something, Mr. Whitfield?" "You can help me by staying exactly the way you are." Grant stepped inside and his eyes moved over the small space with the casual acquisitiveness of a man cataloging what belonged to someone weaker. "See, I know who you used to be. Read all about it this afternoon. And I know something else. I know you put a different history on your application than the one that's true, which the handbook has a very specific word for: falsification. And I know you've been putting your hands on confidential deal documents that a man with a mop has no clearance to touch." He smiled. "Either one of those by itself ends you here, today. And you've got that little girl, don't you, Bills, I'd imagine." The word daughter did not need to be spoken. The way Grant said little girl did something to the air in the room. Michael's jaw set, but he did not move because he could not afford to move. "So here's how it goes," Grant went on. "You saw nothing. You wrote nothing. Night Scribe is a story I'm telling upstairs, and you're going to let me tell it. You stay quiet. You keep your job. You keep the schedule that gets you wherever you need to be at 3 in the afternoon." His gaze drifted across the sink and stopped, and his hand came down and closed around the black lacquer pen lying beside Michael's signed timesheet. He turned it in his fingers, read the worn engraving without any idea what it was, and slid it into his own breast pocket like a man pocketing loose change. "I'll hold on to this. Consider it insurance. You stay useful and invisible, and maybe you get it back." He was gone before Michael's hand had fully closed on the empty air where the pen had been. The video conference with Meridian was scheduled for later that week in the large glass boardroom with the interpreters as luck, and Grant's timing would have it delayed one more day by a canceled flight. Michael was not supposed to be in the room. He was there because the cleaning schedule put him there, dimming the far lights and clearing the service trays while 11 executives arranged themselves around the table, and Raymond Ellis's face resolved on the wall-sized screen, older now, silver at the temples, but wearing the same unhurried smile Michael had faced across a lacquered table a decade before. For 20 minutes, it went the way Grant needed it to go. Ellis spoke in careful English. Grant answered in the confident glide of a man who had never been asked a question he couldn't dodge. Then Ellis, in the mild way of a man testing a lock, switched to Mandarin, a single technical term, then a sentence, then a clause of the very transition provision Michael had circled twice in the dark. And Grant, cornered into speech for the first time, reached for words that were not there. He tried. He produced a mangled approximation of the technical term, the pronunciation so wrong it changed the meaning entirely, and then he attempted to render the clause and rendered it backward, assuring Ellis in front of the entire board that Hale accepted the very consolidation language the clause was designed to smuggle through. On the screen, Raymond Ellis's smile did not change, but his eyes did the way a card player's eyes change when the mark reveals his hand. The room did not understand what had just happened. Michael understood exactly. In one sentence, Grant had confirmed the trap, thrown away the plant, and handed Denise's job across the ocean without knowing he had done any of it. It was the clause about the workers. It was the door left unlocked. And it was walking through right now on the strength of a lie told by a man who couldn't read the language he had claimed. Michael Turner set down his tray. The correction left him before the decision to make it. Did the true term in clean and fluent Mandarin spoken across the room in a voice no one present had ever heard him use. He heard the words leave his own mouth and knew, even as they hung in the air, that 3 years of silence had ended in a single breath. Every head at the table turned. On the screen, Raymond Ellis leaned slowly forward, the negotiator's smile falling away into something far more dangerous recognition. And Grant Whitfield's face drained of every ounce of its confidence as the janitor he thought he owned kept speaking steady, precise, diplomatic, laying the real meaning of the clause bare in front of the woman who had once joked that she'd marry whoever could do exactly this. The correction hung in the air, and the room seemed to hold its breath around it. On the wall-sized screen, Raymond Ellis leaned slowly forward, studying the man in the gray uniform, the way a person studies a face rising out of deep water. He spoke again in Mandarin, not to the table this time, but to Michael alone, a single question with a decade folded inside it. Michael answered him in the same tongue, low and even, and watched recognition finish assembling itself across the old negotiator's face. "Turner," Ellis said, at last switching to English for the benefit of the room. "Michael Turner, I sat across from you in Taipei a lifetime ago. Some faces the years do not erase." His eyes moved past Michael to Grant, then to Samantha, and the warmth in them cooled by several degrees. "I believe we should continue this another day, when your house is in order." The screen went dark, and 11 executives turned as one to look at the janitor beside the service cart. Samantha Hale was not looking at the cart. She was looking at the man, and behind her eyes, a dozen small things dropped into place at once. The corrections that read like intention. The note no machine could have written the night shift ghost she had chased for a week. The quiet voice by the window that had told her to read the clause everyone swore was boring. Like the night crew. Her own words came back to her, and then his, and the shape she had been unable to see finally stood before her in a gray uniform. "It was you," she said. It was not a question. Michael met her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, he did not look away from what he was. "Night scribe," he answered. "Yes." Grant Whitfield recovered faster than shame should have allowed. He had spent a career on a single understanding that the man left standing at the end was never the man who was right, but the man who controlled the story after the room emptied. And the room was emptying now. By the time the executives had filed out trading glances, Grant had stopped being humiliated and started being dangerous. Samantha, for her part, had made a decision that felt like the only sane one available. The deal was not dead. Ellis had set another day, and another day meant a final session, a last chance to sign clean. She needed the true contract in front of her, before then rendered by the one person in the building who could actually read it. She found Michael in the corridor and put it to him, plainly produced the complete accurate translation, every clause before the deadline. She handed him a company laptop herself. For the length of a single conversation, the impossible thing on Michael's shoulders had shifted the money, the surgery, the week into something that looked almost like a door. Grant watched that door open from the far end of the hall, and he went to work that night with the quiet efficiency of a man burying evidence. He knew where Michael had been assigned to work, a small, unused office on 11, the laptop logged in and left overnight. Grant let himself in after the building emptied. He opened the drafts Michael had spent the evening building, clean, fluent English rising line by line out of the Chinese, and he deleted them folder by folder until the screen held nothing. Then he lifted the coffee he'd carried in for exactly this and poured it slowly across the keyboard, and the machine died with a small electric sigh. That was the part anyone might have predicted. The next part was the part that made him what he was. He sat down at another terminal and built a story. He fabricated an access log timestamp stretching back weeks, showing that the custodian, Michael Turner, had reached into confidential Meridian deal files he had no clearance to touch. He drafted 2 emails from throwaway accounts, worded to suggest a man passing information outward, and he assembled it all into a clean packet with the old thin application clipped on top, and he sent it not to Samantha, who had seen too much in that boardroom to be trusted with it, but straight to the board. The framing was elegant, and Grant knew it. A janitor was a curiosity, but a former diplomat who had hidden his entire past to slip unnoticed into a technology company who had secretly accessed its most sensitive files on the eve of its largest deal, that was not a curiosity. That was a plant. That was espionage with a mop for a disguise. The board convened by video the next morning, and not one of the directors who mattered was in the building. They had not been in the boardroom for the reveal. They had not heard Michael's Mandarin or watched Raymond Ellis lean forward in recognition. They had only Grant's packet, the logs, the emails, the buried past dragged into the light and given the ugliest possible name, and from 6 different screens in 6 different cities, they saw exactly what Grant had built them to see, Samantha argued. She told them what she had witnessed with her own eyes, that the man had saved the deal in a single sentence, that the corrections in the margins were the only reason they weren't about to sign away a factory. But the directors were looking at a security log and a falsified application, and a CEO under a board is still under a board. The word liability was spoken, the word exposure. And the instruction that came down was not a request. She was still holding the phone when the hospital's number lit up beneath it. The surgeon's window was closing. Dr. Reeves was leaving at the end of the week, and the slot, the one pair of hands Michael trusted, would go with him. The hospital needed the surgical date secured, now needed the balance settled, or the opening would be released to someone else's child. $70,000 and a handful of days, and both of them running out in the same hour. Samantha found Michael in the loading dock corridor, and she did not hide behind procedure because he had earned better than that from her. "The board's ordering me to let you go," she said. falsification, unauthorized access to the deal files. They think you came here to steal from us." Her jaw tightened around the next part. "I don't believe it. I want you to hear me say that. But I don't have the proof to stop them, and I'm out of time to find it." Michael took it standing still the way he took everything now. He had broken the vow spoken. The language stepped into the light. Let them all see who he was, and it had bought him nothing but this. No schedule, no job, no door left open to the $70,000 his daughter's heart required by the end of the week. "I understand," he said. And because there was a child at home who had made him a blue horse, he turned and walked out of the building without asking her for anything, which was the hardest thing he had done since the day Anna died. He did not sleep. Grace breathed her difficult breath on the couch, and Michael sat on the floor, beside a thing he had not opened in 3 years. The old leather bag from his diplomatic days, cracked at the seams, shoved to the back of a closet behind the winter coats. He had packed away a life inside it, and told himself he would never need any of it again. His hands went through it now, the way they used to go through a briefing, and near the bottom, beneath expired credentials, and a folded map of a city he'd once known street by street. He found what some stubborn instinct had made him keep his own personal notes. Not the official transcripts, the private ones. The margins where a young negotiator had written down the things that never made it into a record, how Raymond Ellis took his tea, which concessions he offered only to disguise the one he actually wanted the exact tell in his voice when a clause was built to be misread. A decade of a man's habits in Michael's own hand, held by no one else on earth. He understood kneeling on the floor at 3 a.m. that he was not powerless. He was the only person alive who held both halves of this, the language and the man. The company had fired the janitor. It had no idea it had also fired the one negotiator who knew precisely how to close its deal. And across the city, Samantha Hale could not sleep either. Her own words would not leave her. "This is deliberate. No machine wrote that. No confident fool wrote that." She had known it in her gut for a week, and she had let a board that never sat in the room override the one thing her instincts had told her plainly. So she did the thing she should have done the moment Grant's packet arrived. She pulled the security footage. She watched the small, unused office on 11, timestamped to the night before. She watched Grant Whitfield let himself in after hours. She watched him open Michael's laptop, delete the drafts folder by folder, and pour a cup of coffee across the keys. And then she cross-checked his fabricated access log against the cameras hour by hour, and found that every timestamp he'd hung on, Michael pointed to moments when the footage showed the office dark and empty, or showed Grant himself, badge and all, seated at a terminal that was never Michael's to begin with. The espionage packet did not describe a spy. It described its own author. She called Michael before the sun came up. The final session with Meridian convened at midday in the glass boardroom, with the interpreters finally returned and seated uselessly along one wall, because the man at the center of the table needed none of them. Grant arrived expecting a coronation and found Michael Turner already there out of the gray uniform, now a stack of handwritten notes squared in front of him. Whatever confidence Grant walked in with faltered at the door, and it did not recover. Raymond Ellis's face filled the screen, and Michael greeted him in Mandarin, not the careful phrasebook courtesy of a company that had rented its fluency, but the easy-weighted greeting of a man addressing someone he had once matched across a lacquered table. He worked through the contract clause by clause in the language it was written in, and when he reached the transition provision, he did not soften it. He read aloud in Ellis's own tongue, precisely what it reserved the right to do. The door left unlocked the plant on the north side. The hundreds of people who would learn a year from now that continuity had never meant what they were told it meant. "You wrote it the way you always write the important things, Raymond," Michael said. And there was no anger in it, only the flat accuracy of a man who knew his counterpart's hand. Quiet, deniable. In the paragraph, nobody reads twice. I sat across from you long enough to know the difference between what you say and what you keep." He set down a page. "We'll take the clause out, all of it, and we'll do the rest honestly the way I know you're capable of because I've seen it." On the screen, the old negotiator was quiet for a long moment, and then something in his face eased. Not defeat, but the particular respect of a craftsman who has finally met someone who can see the whole board. "I told you once in Taipei," Ellis said, "that I never forget a man who reads what I do not say. It seems the years have proven me right." He inclined his head. "Strike the clause, and I will deal only with him. If Hale wants my company's name on this, Mr. Turner speaks for yours, no one else." It was then that Samantha rose from her chair and turned the room's attention where it belonged. She laid it out without drama, the security footage on the large screen. Now Grant letting himself into the office, the deleted files, the coffee, the fabricated log with its timestamps that pointed at empty rooms and at Grant's own badge. She let the images speak, and every executive at the table watched the espionage story collapse into the man who had built it. Grant tried at the last to find a story that could carry him out of the room the way stories always had. There was none. Samantha did not raise her voice. "You're done here," she told him. "Security's outside." And as he was walked from the room protesting to people who had stopped listening, one small object turned up when he was made to empty his pockets, a black lacquer pen worn smooth along one engraved line that had never for 1 second belonged to him. Michael took it back without a word and closed his hand around "Words are the bridge between worlds," and felt the weight of it settle into his palm like a thing returned from very far away. By that afternoon, the footage had gone where Grant's packet had gone. The board that had ordered Michael out reversed itself before the decision had ever formally taken hold, and the ugly word they had reached for was struck from the record as cleanly as the clause. There was no reward check that happened to equal a hospital bill. Life did not fold itself that neatly. What happened instead was that a deal worth more than everything Samantha Hale had ever built stood saved on the table, and the man who had saved it had a daughter whose heart could not wait until the end of the week. Samantha did not hesitate. She offered him the role on the spot. Director of International Partnerships, the bridge Ellis had demanded a title that fit the man far better than any uniform ever had. And then she did the thing that mattered more than the title. She went to the company's resources herself and made the surgery happen. An advance against the work ahead, the balance to the hospital cleared before the day was out. Dr. Reeves kept his slot. Grace kept her surgeon. And on the last open date before the man Michael trusted left for good, a 6-year-old girl went in for the repair her heart had been waiting its whole small life to receive. 6 months later, the blue horse hung framed on the wall of an office on the 11th floor. Grace came by on Fridays after school, healthy in the loud, restless, impossible way of a child whose heart finally kept up with her, and she drew at the corner of her father's desk, while Michael Turner did the work he had been built for long before he ever picked up a mop. He was the reason Denise still ran her press on the north side, the reason the plant's doors stayed open, the reason hundreds of people never learned how close a single buried clause had come to selling their mornings out from under them. Samantha found her way to that office more often than the business strictly required, and neither of them pretended anymore not to notice. What had started as a cruel joke across a boardroom, "Translate this, and I'll marry you," had become slowly over late conversations and shared work and a respect that had nothing to do with a punchline, something neither of them was in any hurry to name, and neither was willing to lose. Together, they built a program out of the whole strange story, a way of looking harder at the people a company like theirs had trained itself not to see the night crew, the ones in gray, the quiet ones. Nobody thought to ask. Anna's pen sat on the desk where anyone could see it. No longer a wound he carried in a breast pocket, but a marker of the distance a man could travel from, invisible to seen. And Michael had made his peace at last, with the language that had once been too heavy to lift Anna's language, the one they had built a whole life inside, because he understood now that carrying it forward was not the same as being crushed by it. It was how he kept her. It was the bridge still standing between the world he had lost and the one he had somehow been given back. Everyone has stood in a room where they were treated like furniture, overlooked, underestimated, certain that no one would ever bother to see what they were truly capable of. So here's the question worth sitting with. What would the people who dismissed you discover if you finally let them see the whole of who you are? Share it below, and if this story stayed with you, subscribe, because the next person the world underestimated is already waiting in the wings,